The days following David's confrontation with Margaret were eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. David moved through the motions of his daily life at the academy with a sense of impending doom. Every step he took, every glance he exchanged with his classmates, felt like it was happening in a strange, muted reality where time stretched and twisted under the weight of his anxiety. Margaret's warning echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the danger he now faced. But rather than cower in fear, David used the silence to prepare himself. He knew that Margaret was planning something. She had made that abundantly clear. The question was when she would strike and how hard the blow would be. David spent his nights poring over the documents he had gathered, searching for anything he might have missed, any piece of evidence that could strengthen his case. His communications with Sarah had become more guarded, their exchanges brief and to the point. They both understood the stakes. There was no room for error now. But as the days passed without any sign of retaliation from Margaret, David's anxiety began to morph into something else: determination. The silence wasn't just ominous, it was an opportunity. Margaret's hesitation, whatever the reason, gave him a chance to steel himself for what was to come. It was the calm before the storm, and David knew he had to be ready for anything. One evening, as David walked alone through the academy's deserted halls, he found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed since he first arrived. The boy who had once been full of hope and ambition, eager to seize the opportunities Margaret had offered, was gone. In his place was someone harder, more wary, and painfully aware of the cost of those opportunities. He thought about the people Margaret had hurt, the lives she had twisted to suit her own ends. He thought about James, who had been forced to abandon the fight, and the countless others who had suffered in silence, their stories buried under the weight of Margaret's power. And he thought about his own future, hanging in the balance, dependent on the outcome of the battle he had chosen to fight. The calm before the storm was a gift, David realized. It was a chance to gather his strength, to prepare himself for the confrontation that was surely coming. But it was also a time for reflection, a moment to remember why he was doing this, why he had chosen to stand against someone as powerful as Margaret. As he reached his dorm room, David paused, his hand resting on the door handle. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs, and then exhaled slowly. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. The final confrontation was coming, and he needed to be ready for whatever form it took. With that thought, David pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was quiet, the faint hum of the city outside the only sound, but the silence wasn't oppressive. It was a reminder of the calm before the storm. And David, now more determined than ever, knew he would face the storm head-on. The storm came sooner than David had anticipated. The morning after his moment of reflection, David received a message summoning him to the dean's office. The tone of the message was formal, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. David knew immediately that this was it, the confrontation he had been bracing for. As he walked across campus, the usually familiar scenery seemed sharper, more vivid, as if the world had come into clearer focus. The grey skies above mirrored the heaviness in his chest, but beneath that weight was a steely resolve. He had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to face whatever Margaret had planned. When David arrived at the dean's office, he found the door slightly ajar, a sliver of light cutting through the dim hallway. He hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open and stepping inside. The room was as austere as ever, but today it was filled with a palpable tension. The dean sat behind his desk, his expression stern, but it was Margaret who commanded the room. She stood by the window, her back to the door, her hands clasped behind her. The moment David entered, she turned to face him, her eyes cold and calculating.
"David," the dean began, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation,
We need to discuss some very serious matters." Margaret remained silent, letting the Dean speak first, but her presence was overpowering. David could feel her eyes on him, assessing, judging, waiting for the moment to strike. "I've been informed of some troubling behavior," the Dean continued, his gaze locked on David. "It appears that you've been conducting an unauthorized investigation into Miss Evans, spreading false accusations that could severely damage her reputation and the reputation of this institution." David's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "They're not false accusations," he replied, his voice steady. "I've uncovered evidence that Margaret has been using her influence to manipulate students and staff for years. People have been hurt, lives have been ruined, and it's time the truth came out." The Dean's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Margaret spoke, her voice smooth and controlled. "David, I've always admired your tenacity. It's one of the reasons I took an interest in you. But you've allowed that tenacity to cloud your judgment. You're chasing shadows, seeing conspiracies where none exist. You've been misled by unreliable sources, and now you're risking everything on a misguided crusade." David met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I know what I've found, Margaret, and I know that you'll do anything to keep it hidden, but this isn't just about me anymore. It's about all the people you've hurt." Margaret's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, perhaps anger, perhaps disappointment, crossing her face. "You're making a grave mistake, David. You're throwing away everything I've given you, everything you've worked for. If you continue down this path, there will be no redemption, no second chances." The room fell into a tense silence as Margaret's words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of consequences. The Dean looked between the two of them, clearly torn between his loyalty to Margaret and the seriousness of the accusations David had leveled. But David didn't waver. He had made his choice long before stepping into this room. "I'm not afraid of you, Margaret," he said, his voice firm, "and I'm not going to back down. You can threaten me all you want, but I'm going to make sure the truth comes out." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded, as if acknowledging the inevitable. "So be it," she said softly, her voice like ice. "But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving David alone with the Dean. The confrontation was over, but the battle had only just begun. As David watched her leave, he knew that whatever came next would be the most difficult fight of his life. The confrontation with Margaret left David shaken, but it also solidified his resolve. He had seen firsthand the lengths she would go to maintain her power, and now, more than ever, he was determined to bring her down. The days following their meeting were a whirlwind of activity, as David and Sarah accelerated their efforts to gather the final pieces of evidence needed to expose Margaret's corruption. Sarah had been relentless in her investigation, using her contacts to dig deeper into Margaret's past and the mysterious disappearance of Richard Langley. Every lead they uncovered seemed to confirm what David had feared. Margaret had indeed been involved in Langley's disappearance, and it was likely that foul play had been involved. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things. They needed irrefutable evidence, something that would force even Margaret's most loyal allies to turn against her. As David and Sarah worked late into the night, sifting through documents and piecing together the timeline of events, a plan began to take shape. "We need to find the missing link," Sarah said one evening as they sat in her office, surrounded by files and notes. "Something that ties Margaret directly to Langley's disappearance. Without that, it's all circumstantial." David nodded, his mind racing. "What about the property records? If we can find a paper trail that shows Margaret's involvement in the failed development, it might lead us to Langley." Sarah tapped her pen against her notebook, deep in thought. It's a good start. I'll see what I can dig up in the county records. But we also need to consider the possibility that Langley might have kept something. Documents, letters, anything that could incriminate Margaret. Do you think he might have left something behind? David asked, the idea sparking a glimmer of hope. It's possible, Sarah replied. People in his position often keep insurance policies just in case. We need to find out where he lived, who he was close to. If we can track down any personal effects, we might find what we're looking for. The plan was risky, but it was the best shot they had. Over the next few days, Sarah worked her contacts in the legal and real estate worlds, searching for any trace of Langley's past. Meanwhile, David continued his research, focusing on the connections between Margaret and the people she had influenced over the years. Their efforts paid off when Sarah uncovered an address linked to Langley, a small, secluded house on the outskirts of the town where the failed development had taken place. It had been left untouched since Langley's disappearance, its contents seemingly forgotten by the world. If anything incriminating remained, it would be there. David and Sarah decided to visit the house together, hoping to find the missing link they so desperately needed. The journey to the house was tense, both of them aware of the risks involved. If Margaret got wind of what they were doing, she would undoubtedly move to stop them. As they pulled up to the property, a sense of unease settled over David. The house was old and weathered, its windows dark and the garden overgrown. It was a place forgotten by time, much like the man who had once lived there. They approached the front door, the creak of the porch underfoot the only sound in the stillness. Sarah produced a set of keys she had obtained through one of her contacts, and with a click, the door swung open, revealing the dusty interior of the house. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice hushed. "If there's anything here, we need to find it quickly." David nodded, stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the corners of the room. As they began to search, opening drawers, rifling through old papers, and checking every nook and cranny, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against the clock. Time was running out, and they needed to find the evidence that would bring Margaret down before she found a way to stop them. As David and Sarah continued their search through Langley's abandoned house, the sense of urgency grew with each passing minute. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Langley had been a meticulous man, someone who kept records of everything. But with that meticulousness came an overwhelming volume of documents, and finding the one piece of evidence that could link Margaret to his disappearance was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Hours passed, the daylight fading into dusk, but David refused to give up. He combed through old files, boxes of letters, and financial records, while Sarah focused on the legal documents and property deeds. The weight of their task was heavy, knowing that this could be their last chance to expose Margaret before she struck back. Finally, just as the light outside began to fade, David's persistence paid off. He opened a small, locked drawer in Langley's desk, and inside he found a folder marked with a single word: contingency. His heart raced as he pulled it out, quickly flipping through the contents. Inside were letters, correspondence between Langley and Margaret. The tone of the letters was cordial at first, discussing business matters and the development project. But as David read further, the tone changed. The final letters were more desperate, with Langley accusing Margaret of betrayal, of pushing him into a corner from which he couldn't escape. And then there was the last letter, Langley's final message before he disappeared. In it, he detailed the threats Margaret had made against him, how she had manipulated events to ensure that he would take the fall if the project failed. It was clear that Langley feared for his life, and he hinted at having left evidence of Margaret's actions in a safe place, should anything happen to him. "This is it," David whispered, his hands trembling as he showed the letter to Sarah. "This is what we needed." Sarah's eyes widened as she read the letter, quickly realizing its significance. This ties her directly to his disappearance. If we can find the evidence Langley mentioned, it'll be the final nail in her coffin. But as they prepared to leave the house, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered it quickly, her expression shifting from determination to concern as she listened. When she hung up, she turned to David, her face pale. "That was one of my sources," she said, her voice tense. "Margaret knows we're here. She's already made a move. She's contacted the authorities, claiming that you're trespassing on private property and that you've stolen confidential documents." David's blood ran cold. "What do we do?" "We need to get out of here," Sarah replied, already moving toward the door. "But we can't leave empty-handed." "We need to take this evidence with us, and we need to get it to someone who can act on it before Margaret has a chance to discredit us." As they hurried out of the house and into the darkening night, David felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were running out of time, and the noose Margaret had placed around his neck was tightening. They got into the car, and as Sarah started the engine, David knew what needed to be done. "I'll stay behind," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "What? No, David, we need to stick together," Sarah protested. "No," David insisted. "You need to get this evidence out of here, and if Margaret's sending the authorities after us, they'll be looking for both of us. If I stay behind and draw them away, you'll have a better chance of getting away clean." Sarah hesitated, clearly torn. "David, this is too dangerous." "I know," he said, meeting her gaze, "but we don't have a choice. If we both get caught, it's over. But if you get this evidence to the right people, we still have a chance." There was a long pause as Sarah considered his words. Finally, she nodded, her eyes filled with both gratitude and worry. "All right, but promise me you'll be careful." "I will," David assured her, though he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. Sarah handed him the folder containing the letters and started the car. David watched as she drove off into the night, the headlights disappearing into the distance. He stood alone in the darkness, the weight of the sacrifice he was making settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew that by staying behind, he was risking everything, his freedom, his future, possibly even his life. But it was a sacrifice he was willing to make if it meant finally bringing Margaret to justice. As the distant sound of sirens began to echo through the night, David steeled himself for what was to come. The storm had finally broken, and there was no turning back now. David stood in the darkness outside Langley's abandoned house, the distant wail of sirens growing louder with each passing moment. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins as the reality of his situation settled in. He had made his choice to stay behind and draw attention away from Sarah, but now, standing alone in the cold night, the weight of that decision pressed down on him like a vice. The lights of approaching police cars flickered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. David knew he didn't have much time. He had to think quickly if he was going to avoid being caught and losing everything they had worked for. But his mind was a whirl of fear and uncertainty, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt completely and utterly alone. As the first police car pulled up to the house, David ducked behind a cluster of bushes, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He watched as two officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they began to search the property. He knew he couldn't stay hidden for long. If they found him, they would arrest him, and everything would be lost. But if he ran, he risked drawing even more attention. Either way, the odds were stacked against him. The minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity as the officers moved closer, their voices muffled by the pounding of David's heart in his ears. He was trapped, cornered, with no clear way out. The fear that had been simmering within him since the beginning now boiled over, threatening to paralyze him in place. But then, as the officers neared his hiding spot, something inside David shifted. The fear was still there, but it was joined by a burning resolve, a refusal to let Margaret win. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to give up now. Silently, David made his decision. He would slip away, avoiding the police without drawing attention. He couldn't afford to be reckless, but he also couldn't afford to be caught. If he was going to have any chance of escaping, he had to be smart, quick, and calm. He waited until the officers were momentarily distracted by a noise from the other side of the property, likely an animal disturbed by their presence, before slipping out from behind the bushes and moving swiftly toward the tree line. The darkness was his ally, and he used it to his advantage, keeping low and quiet as he made his way deeper into the woods that surrounded the house. The sirens faded into the distance as David pushed through the undergrowth, his breath ragged but controlled. The further he got from the house, the more the fear began to recede, replaced by a grim determination. He wasn't out of danger yet, but he had managed to slip through the net, at least for now. As he emerged from the woods onto a quiet, deserted road, David paused to catch his breath. The cold night air stung his lungs, but it also helped clear his mind. He had managed to evade the immediate danger, but the reality of his situation was still grim. He was alone, on the run, with no clear plan and no idea where to turn next. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him as he stood there, the distant glow of the police lights now far behind him. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Had he made the right choice in staying behind? Would Sarah be able to get the evidence to the right people in time? And even if she did, would it be enough to bring Margaret down? The questions swirled in his mind, each one feeding his growing sense of despair. The sacrifice he had made suddenly felt overwhelming, the odds stacked so heavily against him that it seemed impossible to imagine a way out. This was his darkest hour, the moment when everything seemed lost. David knew he couldn't stay here, exposed on the open road. He had to keep moving, find somewhere safe to regroup and think. But as he started walking, a new thought took hold, a realization that cut through the fog of fear and uncertainty. He wasn't just running away from Margaret. He was running towards something. The truth. The justice that had eluded so many others who had fallen victim to her manipulations. And that truth, that justice, was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. With renewed resolve, David began to form a plan. He needed to contact Sarah, find out if she had made it safely and if the evidence was secure. From there, they could figure out the next steps together. But first, he needed a place to hide. Somewhere he could lay low until it was safe to re-emerge. David pulled out his phone, grateful for the foresight of having kept it on silent. He couldn't risk making a call just yet, but he could text. He sent a quick message to Sarah, asking if she was okay and telling her that he had escaped. He also asked if she had any leads on a safe house or a place where they could regroup. As he walked, the minutes stretched on without a reply, each one amplifying his anxiety. But he forced himself to keep moving, knowing that staying in one place too long could be dangerous. Finally, just as he was beginning to worry that something had gone wrong, his phone buzzed with a response. Sarah's message was brief but reassuring. Safe. Meet at the warehouse off Route 9. Stay low. David felt a surge of relief wash over him. Sarah had made it, and they still had a fighting chance. He knew the warehouse she mentioned. It was an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town, rarely used and easy to overlook. It would be the perfect place to lay low and figure out their next move. As he picked up his pace, David's determination solidified. The darkest hour had passed, and while the road ahead was still fraught with danger, he wasn't alone in this fight. Together, he and Sarah could expose Margaret and bring her reign of manipulation to an end. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a shadowy silhouette against the night sky. David quickened his pace, eager to reach the safety it promised. He knew there was no guarantee of victory, but as long as he kept moving forward, there was still hope. And hope, in this moment of darkness, was all he needed to keep fighting. David reached the warehouse just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the deserted landscape. The building was, as he remembered, an old, crumbling structure, forgotten by time and largely ignored by the world around it. It was the perfect place to hide, but also a place that carried its own sense of foreboding. As he approached the entrance, David's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Sarah, inside, back room. The relief he felt at knowing she was safe was tempered by the anxiety of what lay ahead. They were far from out of danger, and every move they made now had to be calculated with precision. Pushing open the heavy, rusted door, David stepped into the warehouse. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the narrow slits in the walls where the morning sun filtered through. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of oil and rust lingered in the air. He made his way cautiously through the maze of abandoned machinery and stacked crates, his senses on high alert. In the back room, David found Sarah sitting at a makeshift table, her laptop open and a pile of documents spread out before her. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "You made it," she said, standing up to greet him. "Barely," David replied, managing a weak smile. "But I'm here. What's our next move?" Sarah motioned for him to sit down, her face serious. "I've been working on a few angles. We've got the evidence, but getting it to the right people is going to be tricky. Margaret's reach is long, and she's probably already working to discredit us. We need to move fast." David nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him once again. "What do you have in mind?" Sarah leaned in, her voice low and urgent. "I've contacted a few trusted sources in the media, people who owe me favors and aren't afraid to take on powerful figures. If we can get this story out through the right channels, we can bypass Margaret's influence. But we need to make sure it hits hard and fast before she has a chance to retaliate." David considered this, his mind racing. It was a risky plan, but it was also their best shot. "And what about Langley's evidence? The letter mentioned something he left behind. Did you find anything?" Sarah's expression darkened slightly. "Not yet. I've been going through the documents we took from the house, but there's nothing concrete. It's possible he hid it somewhere else, or that it was destroyed. Without it, our case is weaker, but it's not impossible. We still have enough to raise serious questions." David's heart sank at the news, but he forced himself to stay focused. "Then we go with what we have. We can't afford to wait any longer." Sarah nodded, her resolve matching his. "Agreed. I'll start drafting the article and prepare the files for release. Once it's out, we'll need to lay low for a while, at least until the dust settles." As they worked together, a sense of urgency filled the air. Every keystroke, every click of the mouse felt like a step closer to the final confrontation. But just as they were about to finalize their plan, the unexpected happened. A loud creak echoed through the warehouse, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching the back room. David and Sarah froze, their eyes locking in a moment of shared fear. Whoever was out there, they hadn't come for a friendly chat. David's mind raced as he considered their options. They were cornered, with nowhere to run. The only way out was through the front entrance, but the sound of the footsteps indicated that their visitor was already between them and the door. "Stay quiet," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "We don't know who it is." But before they could take any action, the door to the back room swung open, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It was someone David had never expected to see, someone who could either be their savior or their doom. The figure stepped into the light, their face partially obscured by the shadows. "We need to talk," they said, their voice carrying a mix of urgency and authority. David's heart raced as he tried to process what was happening. The situation had just taken an unexpected turn, one that could change everything they had been working toward. The figure who entered the room was none other than Richard Langley. The very man David and Sarah had believed to be either dead or in hiding stood before them, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable, and David felt a mix of shock, confusion, and a flicker of hope. If Langley was alive, he might hold the key to finally bringing Margaret down. "Richard Langley," Sarah breathed, her voice filled with disbelief. We thought you were gone." Langley nodded slowly, stepping further into the room, his eyes darting between David and Sarah. "That's what I wanted everyone to think," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It was the only way to stay safe. But when I heard about what you two were doing, I knew I had to come out of the shadows. Margaret has gone too far, and it's time someone put an end to her." David felt a surge of hope, tempered by the reality of the situation. "You have evidence, don't you? Something that ties Margaret directly to what happened all those years ago." Langley's expression hardened. "I do, and I'm willing to share it, but you need to understand what you're up against. Margaret is ruthless. If she finds out I'm alive and working with you, she'll stop at nothing to silence us all." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "We're prepared for that, but we need that evidence, Richard. It's the only way to expose her and put an end to this once and for all." Langley hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then, with a resolute nod, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. "This is it," he said, handing it to David. "It's all in here. Financial records, correspondence, everything. It's enough to bring her down, but it needs to be handled carefully. If this falls into the wrong hands, Margaret will find a way to twist it in her favor." David took the notebook, his hands trembling slightly. The weight of what he held in his hands was immense. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the evidence that could finally put an end to Margaret's reign of manipulation. "Thank you," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means everything." Langley nodded again, his expression softening. "I've been running for a long time, hiding from the consequences of my own mistakes. It's time I stopped running. If we're going to do this, we do it together." Sarah looked at Langley, then at David, a determined glint in her eyes. "We have to move quickly. I'll get this to my contacts in the media, but we need to make sure it's released in a way that Margaret can't suppress." David agreed, feeling a renewed sense of urgency. "We need to coordinate the release across multiple platforms. Make it impossible for her to stop it. Once it's out there, she'll have nowhere to hide." Langley, Sarah, and David spent the next few hours meticulously planning their final move. They contacted Sarah's trusted media sources, ensuring that the story would break simultaneously across several major outlets. They also prepared backup plans, in case Margaret attempted to use her influence to stop the publication. As dawn approached, the plan was finally in place. The three of them sat in the dimly lit room, the tension thick in the air. This was it, the final move in a game that had been years in the making. "Are we ready?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. David and Langley exchanged a glance, both of them nodding. "We're ready," David said. With a deep breath, Sarah pressed send, releasing the files to her contacts. The final move had been made, and now all they could do was wait for the storm to break. The next 24 hours were a blur of activity, tension, and high-stakes drama as the story broke across the media. The evidence against Margaret Evans was overwhelming. and the detailed accounts of her manipulations, coupled with Richard Langley's testimony, sent shockwaves through the public and the institutions she had controlled for so long. The initial reports were followed by an avalanche of commentary and analysis. News outlets dissected every detail of the story, from the financial records that linked Margaret to Langley's disappearance to the personal testimonies from former students and faculty members who had been affected by her machinations. It was a complete and devastating exposure, and for the first time, Margaret found herself on the defensive. As the day wore on, the consequences of the revelations became increasingly clear. The Board of Trustees at the Academy announced an emergency meeting to discuss Margaret's position, and by the evening, they had released a statement suspending her from all roles within the institution, pending further investigation. But the fallout didn't stop there. The authorities, now armed with the new evidence, opened a formal investigation into Margaret's activities, including the suspicious circumstances surrounding Richard Langley's disappearance. Legal experts speculated that she could face serious charges, potentially even criminal prosecution. For David, the experience was surreal. He watched the news unfold from the safety of the warehouse, his phone buzzing constantly with updates and messages from Sarah. The plan had worked. Margaret was finally being held accountable for her actions. But even in victory, David couldn't help but feel a profound sense of weariness. The battle had taken a toll on him, and now that it was over, the adrenaline that had kept him going was beginning to fade, leaving behind exhaustion and a strange sense of emptiness. Late that evening, Sarah arrived at the warehouse, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "We did it," she said, sitting down beside David. "Margaret's empire is crumbling." David nodded, his gaze distant. "I know, it's just, I didn't expect it to feel like this." Sarah looked at him, understanding in her eyes. "It's the price of fighting a battle like this. You put everything on the line, and when it's over, you're left wondering what comes next." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I thought it would feel more final, but there's still so much left unresolved." "There always is," Sarah replied softly. "But you did the right thing, David. You stood up to someone who was hurting a lot of people, and you stopped her. That's no small feat." David managed a small smile, but the weariness was still there. "I couldn't have done it without you, or without Richard." As if on cue, Langley entered the room, a tired but determined look on his face. "It's not over yet," he said, joining them at the table. "The investigation will take time, and Margaret still has powerful allies. We've dealt her a serious blow, but she's not completely out of the game." David nodded, knowing Langley was right. The fight wasn't entirely over, but the tide had turned. Margaret was on the defensive, and for the first time, she was vulnerable. "What happens now?" David asked, looking at both Sarah and Langley. Sarah leaned back, crossing her arms. "Now we let the authorities do their job. We keep an eye on the situation, but we also need to start thinking about the future. Margaret's influence will take time to dismantle completely, but we've set things in motion that can't be undone." Langley added, "And we need to make sure that the people she's hurt get justice. That's going to take time, but it's the right thing to do." David agreed, though the prospect of more battles ahead was daunting. "I'm ready," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to the way things were. The fight had changed him, and there was no returning to the life he had before. As the three of them sat in the warehouse, the first rays of dawn began to break through the windows, casting a soft, golden light across the room. It was a new day, a new beginning, and despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, David felt a sense of quiet resolve. They had won a significant battle, but the war for justice was far from over, and as long as there were people like Margaret Evans in the world, David knew that the fight would continue, but he wasn't alone. Together with Sarah and Langley, he would face whatever challenges came next, armed with the knowledge that they had already accomplished the impossible. And in that, there was hope. In the days that followed Margaret's downfall, life at the academy began to change in ways that David had never imagined possible. The once intimidating atmosphere, thick with unspoken hierarchies and hidden agendas, slowly began to dissipate. As the investigation into Margaret's actions deepened, the Academy's administration made a concerted effort to distance itself from her influence, instituting reforms aimed at restoring transparency and trust. David found himself at the center of these changes, both as a witness to the past and as a participant in the creation of a new future. The story of his role in exposing Margaret spread quickly, turning him into something of a reluctant hero among the students. Many came to him for advice, seeking guidance on how to navigate a system that was still in the process of rebuilding itself. But for David, the most significant change was internal. The battle he had fought had taken a toll on him, but it had also given him a clarity of purpose that he had never felt before. He had seen the worst of what power could do when wielded without accountability, and now he was determined to use his own influence for good. One afternoon, as David walked across the campus, he noticed a group of first-year students gathered near the entrance to the library. They were huddled together, talking animatedly about something that had clearly excited them. Curious, David approached, and as he drew closer, one of the students recognized him. "David Carter, right?" the student said, his eyes wide with admiration. "We were just talking about what you did. It's incredible. You took on Margaret Evans and won." David smiled modestly, still uncomfortable with the attention. "It wasn't just me. I had help. A lot of people were involved in bringing her down." The student nodded eagerly. "Yeah, but you were the one who started it all. You made us realize that we don't have to accept things as they are, that we can change them." The words struck a chord with David, and for a moment he was silent, reflecting on how far he had come since those early days at the academy. He had arrived full of hope and ambition, only to find himself entangled in a web of corruption and manipulation. But through it all, he had never lost sight of his core values: honesty, integrity, and a commitment to doing what was right. "You're right," David finally said, looking at the group of students with renewed determination. "You can change things, but it's not easy. It takes courage, persistence, and a willingness to stand up for what you believe in, even when it feels like the whole world is against you." The students listened intently, their expressions serious. David could see the impact his words were having, and it filled him with a sense of responsibility. These students, just starting their journeys at the academy, would be the ones to carry the torch forward. And it was up to him, and others like him, to ensure they had the guidance and support they needed. As the conversation continued, David shared more of his experiences, offering advice and answering their questions. The students seemed eager to learn, and by the time they parted ways, David felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond the personal victory he had achieved. He was helping to build something new, a culture of integrity and accountability that would hopefully prevent others from falling victim to the same kind of manipulation he had experienced. That evening, as David returned to his dorm, he received a message from Sarah. The investigation was progressing, and it looked like charges would be brought against Margaret in the coming weeks. It was a significant step forward, but it was also a reminder that the fight for justice was ongoing. David knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the future. The dark days were behind him, and a new beginning was on the horizon, one that he was determined to shape for the better. The day of Margaret's trial arrived with a sense of anticipation that hung in the air like a storm about to break. The courtroom was packed, filled with members of the press, students, faculty, and those who had been directly affected by Margaret's actions. The atmosphere was charged, every eye fixed on the woman who had once wielded so much power with impunity. David sat near the back of the room, alongside Sarah and Richard Langley. The three of them had worked tirelessly to bring Margaret to justice. And now, as the trial began, there was a sense of both relief and anxiety. The evidence was overwhelming, but Margaret was nothing if not resourceful, and they knew she would fight to the bitter end. As the prosecution laid out its case, detailing Margaret's manipulations, financial misconduct, and her involvement in Langley's disappearance, David felt a mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing the truth finally come to light, but there was also a somber realization of the damage that had been done. Lives had been ruined, trust shattered, and the ripple effects of Margaret's actions would be felt for years to come. When it was time for the defense, Margaret's lawyers attempted to paint a different picture, one of a philanthropist who had been misunderstood, whose only crime was caring too much about the people she had tried to help. They downplayed the evidence, suggesting that it was all circumstantial and that Margaret had been the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by those jealous of her success. But the arguments fell flat. The evidence was too strong, the testimonies too damning. As the trial went on, it became clear that Margaret's web of lies was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Then, in a surprising move, Margaret took the stand herself. She was poised, calm, and controlled, but there was an undercurrent of desperation in her demeanor. She spoke at length about her work, her intentions, and how she had always believed she was doing the right thing. But when the prosecutor pressed her on the specifics, when they asked about the forged documents, the manipulated students, and the missing funds, Margaret's facade began to crack. Her answers became evasive, her confidence wavered, and for the first time, the courtroom saw her for what she truly was. A woman who had let her ambition and desire for control destroy everything she had built. As the trial drew to a close, the judge called for a recess before delivering the verdict. The room buzzed with tension as people speculated about the outcome, but David remained silent, his thoughts focused inward. He had fought so hard to get to this point, but now that it was here, he felt a strange sense of detachment. The fight had consumed him for so long, and now that it was almost over, he wasn't sure what would come next. When the judge returned, the courtroom fell silent. The verdict was swift and decisive, guilty on all counts. Margaret's expression remained stoic as the judge read out the sentence: several years in prison for her crimes, along with restitution to those she had wronged. It was a fitting end for someone who had caused so much pain, but there was no satisfaction in it for David, only a quiet sense of closure. After the trial, as the courtroom emptied, David, Sarah, and Langley stood together outside, the weight of what they had accomplished settling in. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city, but there was a sense of peace in the air, a feeling that, for now at least, the fight was over. "You did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "We all did." David nodded, but his thoughts were already turning to the future. The trial had revealed the hidden hand that had controlled so many lives, but there were still other battles to fight, other injustices to uncover. Margaret was just one person, and the world was full of others like her. But for now, David allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had stood up to a powerful enemy, faced down his fears, and emerged on the other side stronger for it. The experience had changed him, but it had also given him a new sense of purpose, one that he would carry with him as he moved forward into whatever came next. As they walked away from the courthouse, David looked up at the sky, the last light of day fading into night. The hidden hand had been revealed, and now, in the open air, there was room for something new to grow, something better, something just. And for the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of hope for the future. In the weeks following the trial, the Academy began to slowly rebuild from the damage Margaret Evans had inflicted. The investigation into her dealings led to broader reforms across the institution, aimed at ensuring that no one person could ever again wield so much unchecked power. New leadership was appointed, transparency initiatives were introduced, and the culture of fear and manipulation that had permeated the Academy began to dissipate. David found himself at the center of these changes, not because he sought the spotlight, but because his actions had inspired others to stand up for what was right. Students and faculty alike came to him, not just to thank him, but to seek his advice and perspective on how to move forward. It was a responsibility he hadn't anticipated, but one he accepted with a sense of duty. As he walked through the campus, the atmosphere felt different, lighter, more open. There was a renewed sense of community, a feeling that they were all working together to build something better. The fear that had once gripped everyone was giving way to hope, and it was a transformation that David was proud to have played a part in. One afternoon, as David sat in the newly refurbished student lounge, a place that had once been a hub for Margaret's subtle control, he reflected on the lessons he had learned throughout his journey. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when he had doubted whether he could continue, but through it all, he had discovered a strength within himself that he hadn't known existed. He had learned that standing up to power wasn't just about bravery, it was about persistence, about believing in something greater than oneself. He had learned the importance of allies, of trusting others even when it felt easier to go it alone. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned that true change came from within, from the willingness to confront not only the external forces that sought to control him, but also the internal doubts and fears that threatened to hold him back. As he sat there, lost in thought, Sarah joined him, a warm smile on her face. "You look deep in thought," she said, taking a seat beside him. David returned her smile, grateful for her presence. "Just thinking about everything that's happened, it's hard to believe it's over." Sarah nodded, her expression contemplative. "It's not over, really. The fight against corruption and abuse of power never truly ends. But we've made a difference here, David, and that's something worth holding on to." David agreed, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. "You're right, and I'm ready to keep fighting, wherever that takes me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of them reflecting on the journey they had been through together. It hadn't been easy, and there were scars, both visible and invisible, that they would carry with them. But those scars were a testament to their resilience, to the battles they had fought and won. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the campus, David felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had faced down a formidable enemy, and in doing so, he had discovered who he truly was. The experience had changed him, but it had also solidified his commitment to standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. "Thank you, Sarah," David said quietly, breaking the silence, "for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Sarah smiled, her eyes reflecting the bond they had forged through their shared struggle. "We're a team, David, and I have a feeling this won't be the last time we work together." David nodded, his heart full of gratitude and hope. The lessons he had learned would stay with him forever, guiding him as he moved forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. As the day drew to a close, David knew that his journey wasn't over. But with the lessons he had learned and the allies he had gained, he was ready for whatever came next. The semester was nearing its end, and with it came a sense of closure for David. The Academy had changed dramatically since the trial, and while there was still work to be done, the progress they had made was undeniable. For the first time in a long while, David felt at peace with where he was and where he was heading. But as the days passed, A new question began to emerge in David's mind. What came next? The battle against Margaret had consumed so much of his time and energy that he hadn't had the chance to think about his future. Now that the immediate danger had passed, he was faced with the daunting task of figuring out what path he wanted to take. One afternoon, as David walked through the campus gardens, a place that had become a sanctuary for him during the most stressful times, he found himself contemplating his options. He could continue his studies at the academy, using his newfound influence to help guide the next generation of students. Or he could take a different path, one that involved working more directly in the fight against corruption and abuse of power. As he pondered these possibilities, David's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Richard Langley, who had largely stayed out of the public eye since the trial. The message was brief, but it carried significant weight. "We need to talk. There's something I think you'd be interested in." Intrigued, David agreed to meet with Langley at a quiet cafe in town. When he arrived, he found Langley waiting for him, a thoughtful expression on his face. "David," Langley greeted him warmly, gesturing for him to sit. "I'm glad you came. There's something I've been thinking about, and I wanted to get your take on it." David sat down, curious. "What's on your mind?" Langley leaned forward, his voice taking on a serious tone. "The work we did to expose Margaret, it's not just about bringing one person to justice. It's about setting a precedent, showing that people with power can't just do whatever they want without facing consequences. But the truth is, there are a lot more people out there like Margaret, people who think they're untouchable." David nodded, understanding where Langley was going with this. "You're talking about continuing the fight, aren't you? Taking on more cases, exposing more corruption." Langley smiled slightly. "Exactly. I've been considering starting an organization, something small at first, but with the potential to grow. A group dedicated to investigating and exposing corruption, whether it's in business, politics, or education, and I'd like you to be a part of it." David was taken aback by the offer. It was a bold idea, one that carried significant risks, but also the potential for real impact. The thought of dedicating his life to such a cause was both exciting and daunting. "I don't know what to say," David admitted, his mind racing. "It's a huge responsibility." Langley nodded, his expression serious. "It is, but I've seen what you're capable of, David. You have the skills, the determination, and the integrity to make a real difference. This isn't just about fighting for justice. It's about building a better future." The idea resonated with David on a deep level. It felt like the natural extension of everything he had been through, the next step in a journey that had already changed him so profoundly. After a long pause, David met Langley's gaze, his decision made. "I'm in," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "Let's do this." Langley smiled, a look of approval in his eyes. "Welcome aboard, David. This is just the beginning." As they discussed the details of their new venture, David felt a sense of purpose settle over him. The fight against Margaret had been difficult, but it had also prepared him for something greater. He was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he was not alone and that together they could make a difference. The path forward was uncertain, but it was a path that David was eager to walk. And with Langley by his side, he knew that they had the potential to create real, lasting change. As they left the cafe, the sun shining brightly overhead, David felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. The future was full of possibilities, and he was ready to face them head-on. This was his new beginning, and he couldn't wait to see where it would take him. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button.